It was just another morning on live television, or so everyone thought. The audience chatted, the cameras rolled, and the hosts bantered back and forth, the usual mix of humor and light debate that people loved. But then something happened that nobody in that studio would ever forget. Whoopi Goldberg, the quick-witted, always on her toes co-host, froze. Her words caught in her throat. Her eyes widened slightly, and she didn't blink for a moment. And the reason wasn't a technical glitch or a sudden camera mishap. It was something Jonathan Roumie said about Jesus. For a moment, the entire studio went silent. The laughter faded. The chatter stopped. Even the crew behind the cameras seemed to hold their breath. You could almost feel the tension in the air as everyone tried to process what had just been spoken. Normally, live television is fast-paced, with hosts ready to jump in, make jokes, or pivot the conversation. But this moment was different. This was heavy. This was unexpected. Jonathan Roumie, the actor known for portraying Jesus on screen, leaned forward slightly, speaking in a calm, deliberate voice. There was no theatrics, no exaggerated hand gestures, no attempt to dominate the conversation. Just a quiet, firm statement that carried weight far beyond the television studio. People think they know what following Jesus means, he said. But too often, they miss the heart of it completely. Even for Whoopi, a woman who has navigated decades of live television, interviews with politicians, celebrities, and spiritual leaders alike, these words landed in a way she wasn't prepared for. She looked at him, slightly incredulous, yet fascinated. The pause stretched longer than anyone expected, leaving a vacuum of silence that drew every eye in the room toward him. And in that silence, you could feel the magnitude of what was being said. This wasn't a soundbite or a scripted line. It was a statement meant to challenge, to provoke thought, and maybe even unsettle the comfortable assumptions everyone held. It was the kind of moment that would live on in replay clips, in social media shares, and in conversations around dinner tables long after the cameras stopped rolling. The question on everyone's mind was simple. What exactly did he mean? And how would the hosts, especially Whoopi, react next? The tension was palpable. Every viewer, every member of the crew, and every person watching at home knew something extraordinary was happening. Something that was about to shake the studio in ways no one expected. The morning had started like any other on the live talk show set. The cameras were rolling, the crew bustling quietly behind the scenes, adjusting lighting, moving microphones, and making sure every shot was perfect. The audience was lively, chatting, sipping coffee, and waiting for the familiar banter that made this show a morning staple. Whoopi Goldberg, seated at the main host desk, leaned forward with her usual energy, cracking jokes, gesturing animatedly, and keeping the conversation lively. Around her, the other co-hosts smiled and laughed, exchanging light-hearted jabs and sharing stories that painted the studio in a warm, comfortable rhythm. Everything felt normal, too normal, perhaps. Then Jonathan Roumie walked onto the set. Not with a fanfare, not with the pomp that some celebrities demand. No entourage, no flashy clothes, no dramatic gestures. He moved quietly, deliberately, with the calm presence of someone who didn't need the world to notice him because his work, his purpose, and his conviction spoke volumes on their own. Roumie had a reputation for portraying Jesus on screen with incredible authenticity. He had spent years studying not just the script, but the essence of the character, the compassion, humility, and humanity behind the legend. And today, for reasons that would soon become apparent, he was not there to promote a film or discuss an episode. He was there to speak, to challenge, to remind everyone, quietly but firmly, of something that most people had forgotten. He approached the host desk slowly, placing his hands lightly on the edge. His eyes met Whoopi's, calm but unyielding, like he had a message that demanded attention, but not out of force, out of truth. The studio, sensing the shift in energy, fell slightly quieter. Even the audience, caught up in the normal rhythm of chatter and applause, leaned forward subconsciously. What I want to share today, Roumie began, his voice soft but penetrating, is something people rarely talk about, because it's easier to misunderstand than to confront. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. You could almost hear the silence stretching between syllables, a moment so pregnant with tension that every face in the studio reflected it. Whoopi, always quick to interject, stayed quiet, her brow furrowed, her instincts telling her this wasn't just another guest segment. The crew exchanged glances. Cameras zoomed in instinctively. The producers behind the monitors whispered, unsure if they should cut to a commercial break. But the words were already out, and the moment had its own momentum. Roumie continued, speaking slowly, deliberately. Jesus was more than the figure people quote. He was the embodiment of humility, courage, and love. He didn't need to impress anyone. And yet, people spend their lives claiming to follow him, while missing the essence entirely. The statement landed like a weight in the room. Whoopi's lips parted slightly, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. The other co-hosts, normally ready with a joke or a rebuttal, were silent. Even the audience, thousands of eyes fixed on the stage, felt the gravity of the moment. This was not just a discussion about faith, it was a mirror being held up to everyone's understanding of it, a challenge that could not be ignored. Roumie leaned back slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken. Too often, he continued, we look for miracles in grand gestures, in spectacles, in loud proclamations. But the real miracle is in quiet acts of kindness, in courage that doesn't seek applause, in love that asks for nothing in return. Now, the studio was dead silent. Every microphone, every camera, every person was tuned into him. And in that silence, Whoopi Goldberg froze, caught between disbelief and reflection. For a woman who had interviewed some of the most famous and controversial figures in history, this was different. This wasn't a headline or a punchline. This was something deeper, something that demanded pause. Roumie's words weren't just philosophical, they were a challenge. Imagine, he said, looking around the studio with steady eyes, what the world would be like if we all practiced what he actually taught. Compassion without judgment. Humility without pride. Courage without self-interest. The energy in the room shifted. Viewers at home, watching the live broadcast, could almost feel it through their screens. The atmosphere was charged, not with controversy or conflict, but with awe and tension. This was the kind of moment television rarely captures, a pause so powerful that even those accustomed to rapid-fire conversation could not ignore it. Whoopi's fingers tapped lightly on the desk, a subtle sign of thought. She wasn't just reacting to Roumie's words, she was processing them. Something in her expression suggested a mix of admiration, surprise, and even a hint of guilt. The realization was slowly dawning. This wasn't about performance. This was about truth. And truth, Roumie was reminding them, has a way of stopping you in your tracks. By now, the audience, the crew, and even the viewers at home were fully engaged. No one spoke. Every eye followed his every move. And in that calm, deliberate silence, Jonathan Roumie had already done something remarkable. He had made an entire studio stop, reflect, and reconsider what it really means to understand faith, humility, and purpose. And that was only the beginning. The studio had gone quiet, but the tension was far from over. Every eye was fixed on Jonathan Roumie. Every ear strained to catch the next word. For a moment, it felt as though time had slowed, the usual hum of cameras, lights, and chatter replaced by something heavier, a presence that demanded attention. Jonathan leaned slightly forward, his calm expression unwavering. "I want to be honest with you all," he said. "Most people think following Jesus is about perfection, about rituals, about the right words. But it's not. Not at all. It's about heart. It's about action. And it's about the courage to live what you believe, even when nobody's watching." The words seemed simple, but the weight behind them was anything but. Whoopi's hand hovered over her notes, then dropped. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. She didn't speak. Not because she couldn't, but because the words felt too small for the moment. Her mind raced. How could she respond? How could anyone respond? Roumie continued, each sentence deliberate, each pause heavy with meaning. People want to claim their faith, to speak loudly about their devotion, but they forget the small things. The kindness no one notices. The love no one applauds. The sacrifices made in silence. Those are the things that matter most. A murmur ran through the audience, a single exhale, as if they were all holding their breath, realizing that the conversation was no longer just about religion, but about life itself. Some viewers in the studio seats leaned forward, instinctively gripping the edge of the chairs. Even the crew members behind the cameras seemed hypnotized, as though every movement of the man at the desk carried a lesson they couldn't ignore. Whoopi shifted slightly in her chair. Usually, she was ready with a quip, a retort, or a witty observation. Today, none of that came. She simply watched, her eyes wide, trying to absorb every syllable. It wasn't criticism or shock in her expression. It was something deeper. It was reflection, recognition, and perhaps even a little shame. Then came the line that would change the energy of the studio entirely. Most people fear being judged more than they fear being wrong. They'd rather look righteous than be compassionate. And that is why the world suffers, because we have forgotten what it truly means to follow him. The silence became absolute. Even the faint hum of the ventilation system seemed to vanish. Every camera operator, every assistant, every producer froze in place. Whoopi's hands rested flat on the desk. Her mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but no sound came. Roumie paused for a moment, letting the statement settle like a stone dropped into still water. And then, with a quiet but firm voice, he added, "Faith without action is empty. Belief without love is hollow." And yet, most of us keep pretending that words alone are enough. A shiver ran through the studio. The co-hosts, usually quick to interject, glanced at each other, unsure if they should continue or remain silent. The audience shifted uneasily, sensing that this was not just a segment, it was a moment that demanded introspection. Whoopi finally broke the silence, but not with words. She exhaled audibly, leaned back slightly, and nodded almost imperceptibly. Her eyes never left Roumie. It was as if she had been struck by the truth of what he was saying, and in that nod, she acknowledged it. Roumie's calm, deliberate energy contrasted sharply with the electricity now running through the room. Every reaction, subtle or not, added to the tension. People whispered quietly, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others murmuring agreements. A few viewers held up phones, recording, unable to tear their eyes away. Then he leaned back, and the final line hit with almost surgical precision. Jesus didn't ask for followers who could quote scripture. He asked for hearts willing to love without expectation, to act without reward, and to stand for truth even when it is inconvenient. And that is the part we all seem to forget. At that moment, Whoopi Goldberg froze completely. Not out of fear, not out of confusion, but because she realized the weight of the moment. This was more than an interview. More than a segment. It was a reflection, a mirror held up to everyone in the studio and everyone watching at home. It was uncomfortable. It was humbling. And it was undeniable. Even after Roumie leaned back and allowed a brief pause, the silence lingered. Producers glanced at each other. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every second. The audience, both live and remote, felt the gravity. The energy in the room had shifted. What had started as a normal morning show had transformed into something far more powerful. A moment that reminded everyone that words, when spoken with intention and truth, can stop time itself. And though no one yet knew it, that frozen moment, the look on Whoopi's face, the stillness of the room, the collective pause in the studio, was the moment that would define this episode forever. Because in that pause, everyone realized something important. True wisdom doesn't shout. True insight doesn't demand attention. Sometimes, it simply stands there, quietly, until we notice it. And when we do, it has the power to stop us in our tracks. For a moment, the studio remained frozen in an almost unnatural silence. It wasn't just Whoopi Goldberg, everyone in the room felt it. The air seemed heavier, charged with a mix of awe, shock, and quiet reflection. It was the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, and the space around you. Whoopi, normally quick to respond with humor or sharp commentary, remained still. Her eyes followed Jonathan Roumie as he sat back, calm and collected, as if the storm of silence around him didn't exist. Yet, in the way she furrowed her brow and pursed her lips, the audience could see the wheels turning in her mind. This wasn't a moment for words, it was a moment for understanding. The co-hosts glanced at each other, uncertain. One opened their mouth to speak, then closed it again. The producers exchanged hurried whispers, debating whether to cut to a commercial or let the tension linger. But the cameras didn't move. The directors seemed frozen too, sensing that this was one of those rare live moments that can't be interrupted. Roumie's presence had shifted the energy in the room entirely. Where moments ago there had been casual banter and rehearsed segments, now there was a quiet gravity. People were processing what had just been said. Not everyone agreed, and not everyone even fully understood, but the weight of the truth in his words was undeniable. The audience reacted slowly, almost hesitantly. A few gasps slipped out. Some leaned forward in their seats, mouths slightly agape. Others whispered softly to their neighbors, repeating fragments of what they had just heard. Did he just say? Wow. That's powerful. The murmurs grew, but no one spoke over Roumie. They weren't ready. Behind the scenes, the crew exchanged glances that spoke volumes. This wasn't just another interview clip. This was a defining moment, something that would be shared across social media, dissected by commentators, and remembered by viewers long after the cameras stopped rolling. Phones came out, quietly recording, capturing every nuance of the reactions for posterity. Even the studio audience felt the shift on a personal level. They hadn't come expecting this kind of reflection. They hadn't expected to be confronted so directly with ideas that challenged their own assumptions. Yet here it was, delivered with calm authority and absolute conviction. Some audience members nodded slowly, almost reverently. Others stared, unsure how to react. Whoopi finally exhaled audibly, the first sound to break the tension. She leaned back in her chair, her hands folded on the desk, and let the weight of the moment settle. That really hits, she murmured quietly, almost to herself. It wasn't a comment meant for the cameras. It was a real, human reaction to being confronted with profound insight. Roumie, seeing the subtle shift in energy, didn't push further. He understood the power of silence. He let the words linger, let them sink into the hearts and minds of everyone present. Sometimes the most effective statements are the ones that don't require immediate explanation or defense. They simply exist, leaving the listener to grapple with them in their own way. A co-host finally broke the silence with a small, respectful nod. You know, that really makes you think about how we approach faith, kindness, and, well, life itself. The words were tentative, careful, acknowledging the impact without trying to undermine it. It was the first sign of dialogue since Roumie had spoken. The audience responded, some with quiet applause, others with murmurs of agreement. It was subdued, not the kind of reaction you might expect on a talk show, but it fit the gravity of the moment. This wasn't entertainment. This was reflection. Whoopi finally spoke, her voice steady but softer than usual. Jonathan, that was something else. I mean, I think everyone here, and at home, needed to hear that. It's one of those moments that makes you pause, and really think. Roumie nodded slightly, acknowledging her words but not seeking praise. That's all I hope for, he said quietly. That people pause. That they reflect. And maybe, change a little, in the ways that matter most. The energy in the studio had shifted permanently. Where there had been casual chatter, there was now contemplation. Where there had been humor, there was now respect. And where there had been normalcy, there was now a sense of gravity, a recognition that something profound had just happened in that space. Even as the cameras continued to roll, the moment had been captured perfectly. Not as entertainment, not as a viral clip, but as a genuine human experience. It was a moment where silence spoke louder than words, where reflection carried more weight than applause, and where the power of truth could stop an entire studio in its tracks. For Whoopi Goldberg, Jonathan Roumie, and everyone watching, this reaction wasn't about shock for the sake of ratings. It was about realization, about the quiet power of words when spoken with sincerity, and the impact they can have on people willing to listen. And as the segment drew to a close, even the smallest movements in the room, the shuffle of papers, the quiet breaths, the slow blinking of eyes, reminded everyone that this was a moment that would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. Because sometimes, the most powerful reaction isn't in what you say, it's in the silence that follows. The studio was still, but the tension had transformed into something heavier, anticipation. After Jonathan Roumie's words, everyone sensed that the moment was far from over. There was something unspoken in the air, a question lingering in every mind. What would come next? Roumie leaned slightly forward, eyes calm but piercing, as if he knew the effect his words had caused. What I said, he continued, isn't just about faith. It's about life. It's about the choices we make when nobody is watching. And it's about courage, the kind of courage most people avoid because it's uncomfortable. For a brief second, the studio felt like it was holding its breath. Whoopi Goldberg, normally a whirlwind of energy and wit, was frozen once again, but this time, it wasn't surprise that had her still. It was realization. The realization that the segment, which had begun as a casual conversation, had turned into a challenge, a mirror held up to everyone's life choices, priorities, and values. Roumie continued, softly but deliberately, imagine a world where people lived by these principles. A world where compassion is louder than judgment. Where humility is stronger than pride. Where courage isn't a spectacle, but a quiet act of truth every day. That world, it isn't far away. It begins with us. The room remained quiet, but the silence was no longer empty. It was charged, vibrant, full of the electricity of reflection. The audience began to murmur, softly at first, then a little louder. People leaned toward each other, repeating fragments of what they had heard. "Did he really just say that?" whispered someone near the front. "I think we all need to hear that again," said another. And then came the final reveal, the line that would etch itself into the memory of everyone in that studio and everyone watching at home. "I say this not because I want attention," Roumie said, his voice steady, "but because I want to remind everyone here, and everyone watching, that living a life of love, humility, and courage is possible. And that even the smallest actions matter. Even the quietest acts of kindness can ripple through the world. And sometimes, that ripple starts right here, right now, with us." The words hit like a wave. Cameras captured the subtle reactions, the way Whoopi's eyes glistened, the slow nod of her head, the murmurs of agreement from co-hosts and audience members alike. A few people wiped away tears, quietly moved by the truth of the statement. Phones were raised again, capturing not just words, but emotion, the unspoken understanding that this was more than an interview. This was a lesson, a moment, a revelation. Roumie paused, letting the statement hang in the air. He didn't rush, didn't explain further, didn't dramatize. He simply allowed the words to settle into the hearts of those present. Sometimes, he knew, the quietest reveal carries the heaviest weight. Finally, Whoopi spoke, her voice soft but resonant. "Jonathan, that was profound. Honestly, I've interviewed hundreds of people, but this is different. You didn't just speak to us, you spoke to the part of us that's easy to forget. The part of us that wants to do good, but sometimes doesn't." The audience erupted, not with laughter or applause, but with the sound of recognition. People were nodding, whispering to each other, some even standing in small, tentative ovations. The energy in the studio had shifted completely, from stunned silence to reflective awe. It wasn't entertainment anymore. It was a lesson, shared in real time, that no one could ignore. Roumie smiled faintly, as if acknowledging the ripple effect of his words. "That's all I ever hope for," he said, quietly. "That someone, somewhere, will take a step toward living these truths. That someone will pause, reflect, and then act, not for recognition, not for praise, but because it's right." The revelation left the entire studio changed. Whoopi's earlier freeze had melted into contemplation, into understanding, into a recognition of her own responsibility to live authentically. The co-hosts, once hesitant, were now fully engaged, asking questions, reflecting on their own lives, and sharing thoughts with the audience. The viewers at home, sensing the sincerity and gravity of the moment, were moved to comment, share, and reflect in real time. For everyone present, the reveal wasn't just about Jonathan Roumie's statements. It was about the truth behind them. About the reminder that words, when spoken with intention and conviction, can transform a room. That one voice, calm and deliberate, can stop time and demand reflection. That even in the chaos of life, a moment of clarity can change everything. And in that studio, on that ordinary morning, it had. Because sometimes, the biggest reveal isn't in a secret or a dramatic twist. It's in truth. Simple. Honest. Unavoidable. And when you encounter it, it stops you. Silences you. Forces you to reflect. And sometimes, it even changes you. The cameras continued to roll, but the energy in the studio had completely shifted. Where moments earlier there had been tension and silence, there was now a quiet buzz of introspection. People weren't talking over each other or rushing to make a joke. They were talking thoughtfully, quietly, and with a new sense of awareness. Whoopi Goldberg sat back in her chair, her expression softened, her hands resting gently on the desk. She glanced at Jonathan Roumie, her eyes reflecting a mix of respect, wonder, and genuine admiration. "You know," she said quietly, "I've been on this set for decades. I've interviewed everyone from politicians to spiritual leaders. I've seen so many people come in with grand statements, but very few actually make you stop and think the way you just did. Roumie smiled faintly. He didn't boast or try to take credit. Instead, he let the moment speak for itself. "I don't need to impress anyone," he replied. "I just hope that people pause, reflect, and, if they can, take even one small step toward living these truths." It was remarkable to see how the rest of the studio responded. The co-hosts, once hesitant to engage in this unexpected depth, were now leaning in, asking questions that reflected their own personal experiences. "How do you stay so consistent with this?" one asked. "Even when the world seems to reward everything else?" Roumie answered patiently, calmly, his words measured but powerful. "Because it's not about reward. It's about choice. Every day, you choose how to act, how to love, how to treat others. That choice is your life." Whoopi nodded slowly, absorbing every word. The earlier freeze, the shock, the awe, it had transformed into something else entirely. She realized that it wasn't enough to admire wisdom from afar. The challenge was to apply it, to live it. Her co-hosts, too, seemed to recognize this subtle shift, their previous banter replaced with sincerity and reflection. Even the audience, both live and watching from home, felt the effect. People whispered, some quietly cried, others simply sat in silence, contemplating the message. The energy was no longer about entertainment. It was about human connection, about understanding, about applying insight to one's own life. Social media notifications started buzzing in the background as viewers shared clips and reflections, but no one seemed concerned about likes or shares. They were caught in the moment, fully present. As the segment drew to a close, Roumie stood to leave, his presence calm and unassuming, yet powerful. He didn't announce any grand gesture, didn't demand applause. He simply gave a nod, acknowledging the connection he had created in the room, and walked toward the exit. Whoopi leaned forward, her voice gentle but steady. "Jonathan, thank you. Not just for your words, but for showing us what it looks like to truly live them. I think we all needed that reminder." Roumie paused at the door, turning back briefly. "Remember," he said quietly, "it's not the grand gestures that define us. It's the small acts of courage, kindness, and humility, every day, in every moment, whether anyone sees or not. That is how life changes. That is how we change." The room exhaled collectively. Cameras stopped rolling as the producers began to relax, and the studio staff exchanged smiles, realizing that something extraordinary had happened. What began as a simple interview had evolved into a life lesson, an experience that would be remembered far longer than the airtime it had occupied. Whoopi reflected on the moment internally, a soft smile forming on her lips. "It's incredible," she thought, "how one person, speaking with calm and sincerity, can stop a room, and maybe even a life, in its tracks." She turned to the co-hosts, her tone warm. "I think we should all take a moment to really consider what was said today. It's rare that a guest teaches more than just what's on their script." Even as normal conversation slowly resumed, the lesson lingered. The subtle shift in perspective, the quiet realization of responsibility toward kindness and compassion, had left its mark. The energy in the studio was different now, thoughtful, reflective, and quietly determined. And in that quiet determination lay the resolution, the knowledge that true wisdom is not measured by applause, ratings, or spectacle. True wisdom is measured by its ability to make people pause, reflect, and act, not for recognition, but for the right reasons. For Whoopi Goldberg, the co-hosts, the crew, and the audience, the lesson was clear. Life is not about performing virtue. It is about living it quietly, consistently, and with courage. And sometimes, all it takes is one calm, deliberate voice to remind the world of what truly matters. As the studio lights dimmed and the cameras finally shut off, there was a sense of closure, not the kind that ends a show, but the kind that changes hearts. That morning, no one left the studio the same way they had arrived. And for anyone watching, the lesson was clear. True power isn't loud. True courage isn't flashy. True change begins quietly, in moments like these, when reflection becomes action. And in that silence, the world, at least for that moment, felt just a little lighter, a little wiser, and a little more compassionate. By the time the cameras had stopped rolling and the lights dimmed, the energy in the studio had shifted from awe to reflection. What began as a seemingly ordinary morning talk show segment had become something extraordinary, a quiet, unshakable lesson in humility, courage, and the power of living your truth. Jonathan Roumie had left, but his words lingered, echoing in the minds and hearts of everyone present. They weren't flashy, dramatic, or designed for applause. They were simple, deliberate, and profound. And that, perhaps, was the most remarkable thing of all. Whoopi Goldberg, who had frozen at the height of the segment, now sat quietly in her chair, her thoughts running deeper than the conversation she had been expecting. She realized that this wasn't just about faith or religion, it was about life itself. About the choices we make when no one is watching. About the courage to act with kindness, humility, and integrity every single day. About understanding that true power isn't measured in fame, recognition, or performance. It's measured in how we treat others, in what we do when no one sees, and in the quiet acts of courage that ripple through the world. The co-hosts, too, reflected on what had just happened. They discussed, in hushed tones, how rare it is to encounter a moment that stops you in your tracks, not with shock, but with understanding. Some admitted that they had been so caught up in routines, ratings, and appearances that they had lost sight of the small, meaningful acts that truly define a life. Others were inspired to think about how they could apply the message to their own families, friends, and communities. Even the studio audience, who had been quietly captivated throughout, carried the weight of the lesson as they left their seats. Phones were still buzzing, not with chatter or gossip, but with notes, reflections, and shares of the segment online. The ripple effect was immediate. Clips of Roumie's statements circulated. People discussed the words at home, in coffee shops, and in offices, all processing the idea that quiet, consistent kindness and integrity are more powerful than grand gestures or loud proclamations. And that was the moral of the story, clear and undeniable. Respect, humility, and courage are not meant for the stage or the spotlight. They are meant for the quiet moments, the choices that go unnoticed, and the decisions we make when no one else is watching. Because in those moments, character is revealed, lives are shaped, and the world changes. One action, one choice, one ripple at a time. Jonathan Roumie's visit had reminded everyone of a fundamental truth. The world doesn't need more spectacle. It needs more hearts willing to act rightly, even when it's inconvenient. More people willing to pause, reflect, and choose compassion over judgment. More moments of quiet courage that speak louder than any speech, louder than any applause, and louder than any viral headline. Whoopi's final reflection was simple, yet powerful. This, she said softly, almost to herself, is the kind of lesson that doesn't fade when the cameras stop. It's a reminder that life isn't about performance, it's about integrity. And sometimes, all it takes is one voice, calm and sincere, to make everyone stop and listen. So here's the takeaway for everyone watching this story. Respect isn't something reserved for the famous, the powerful, or those in the spotlight. Respect is for everyone, friends, strangers, colleagues, and even those we think are insignificant. Courage isn't always dramatic. It's often quiet, consistent, and unseen. And true change doesn't come from noise. It comes from small, deliberate acts of kindness, honesty, and compassion that ripple outward into the world. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. How can you bring a little more humility, courage, and compassion into your day? How can you make choices that truly matter, even when no one is watching? Type respect in the comments if you believe humility and quiet courage are the real measures of strength. Share this story with someone who could use a reminder that small, deliberate acts of goodness can change the world. And tell us, where are you watching from? I want to thank every kind soul personally, because this lesson isn't just for the studio, it's for all of us. Because the truth is simple, timeless, and universal. The world remembers not the noise, the applause, or the grand gestures. The world remembers those who act rightly, quietly, and with love. And that, more than anything else, is the power that changes lives.